known as the Fireside Poets. This is a fairly discrete and homogenous group of poets from the mid 19th century, primarily located in New England, essentially Massachusetts, some from Maine, and a little bit from New York, although that is sort of the far wing of it. They had great popularity. They were very, very well and widely read throughout the early American states. And this came from the quality of their work, which was rooted in a kind of domesticity, and their brand as a movement. They were called the Fireside Poets because the idea was that families would gather around the fireside and read these poems aloud to one another. And they had a great homey quality to them that was rooted in a kind of universality and sentimentality that just quite frankly sells well. So they were very, very successful. The core group begins essentially with William Cullen Bryant, who is a little bit older, about a decade or so older than the rest of them, and has kind of a tenuous relationship to the whole. He moved to New York, which is, very not so New Englandy. But the core of them are the big four: Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, John Greenleaf Whittier, James Russell Lowell, and Oliver Wendell Holmes. Senior, not junior. He wasn't the Supreme Court justice. And then sort of again tangentially you can lump in Emerson, Ralph Waldo Emerson, with them, who made a conscious and deliberate break with them in his call for a homegrown American style of art, that which was in a bit of contrast to the aesthetics of the Fireside Poets, who were generally keeping within European and British traditions of what poetry should be, what poetry can do. And so they were borrowing romanticism and just kind of doing that in an American milieu. But generally speaking, the characteristics of their work is fairly distinctive. Obviously, the British and European emulation. They worked in very regular rhyme and meter, which is convenient for memorization and recitation. Another name for this group. They were also known as the schoolroom poets because they were so popular with schoolwork, where students would sit at the head of the class and recite their poems. And because of the regular dog trot meter and the very regular rhyme scheme, they're very easy to memorize, and so kids could just stand there with the teacher off in the corner watching, and they would recite these poems, schoolroom poets. Part of that is also that the poems tend to be very didactic. The narrative ones tend to tell stories of historical importance, about great historical figures, primarily American, great historical events, primarily of the Revolution, that sort of content. But it is also not just about memorizing the facts, but also imparting specific lessons. This poetry tended to be very heavily moralistic as well. And so there is a great conservatism about it almost, where they are imparting good morals to the youth. They are using the poetry in a somewhat utilitarian form to impart good morals to the readers and the audience. This comes about in a kind of saccharine quality from time to time, heavily moralizing, obviously, but it veers into the sentimental, the very conservative from time to time, where it is just celebrating home and hearth and mom's apple pie. And that can, depending on your perspective, get a little tiring sometimes. Probably their most prominent quality, their most prominent characteristics as a group is the prominence of New England settings. Again, most of their poetry is about living in New England. There's not terribly much outside of that. But the rural character of it is very much of simple farmers in small towns in the backwoods of New England. Lots of snowy scenes, lots of fall foliage, all of that classic Americana, New Englandy, Norman Rockwell-ish world that is a little Hallmark cardy, but it is, well, it is quite touching in its way. And it is commercially viable. And so that helped. They were going after a large scale audience with their writing. Their voice is very unsophisticated. There are very few large Latin words going on there. It was aiming for a fairly universal readership where it is welcoming to everyone. And you can be a little snide about that, but it is a very open embrace of readers in general, despite or regardless of level of education or sophistication. The idea of the fireside, of families, ordinary rural families gathering around the hearth to enjoy some reading together. There is no sense within that image that any of them have to be particularly well educated. They just have to know how to read, and the symbolism that is at work in there is often kind of rudimentary. There's not a great deal of complicated metaphor going on, but the work itself does achieve a certain richness. These are generally fairly well-educated, sophisticated, highly literate men. Many of whom had great contact with Harvard. Longfellow, Lowell, and Holmes all taught there. Lowell, Holmes, and Emerson studied there. They got their educations there, and they made their livings generally outside of the poetry, as in very literate circumstances. Longfellow and Lowell were professors of modern languages. Holmes was in the medical school. He did poetry as a side hustle. But Bryant, very famously, was a newspaperman. So was Whittier. They were in publishing and that stuff. And so they were very cultured, very well educated themselves. Longfellow very famously also did a great tour of Europe. And he was not alone in that. The cross currents were fairly notable, even as they were cultivating this specific Americanism of their poetry. The contact was very obvious. The emulation and the lines of imitation even were very prominent. This was part of a larger movement within the Romantic era of America at the time. Their work bears striking similarities to the Leatherstocking novels of James Fenimore Cooper, specifically in their relative simplicity of style and content, and the replanting of European models into American soil. But they are also significantly in the visual arts, pretty analogous to the Hudson River School of painters. Specifically, look at the work of Thomas Cole. Thomas Cole, an immigrant from England when he was 17, widely regarded as the first significant American landscape artist. He was self-taught as a painter, but he was also a friend of William Cullen Bryant. Bryant wrote a sonnet about him as he was embarking on his great European tour in around 1829. And Asher Durand, one of Cole's colleagues in the Hudson River movement, Asher Duran painted the two of them, painted Cole and Bryant taking a walk in the Catskills, as they were known to do. They were neighbors and friends and would go for long walks through the woods. Asher Duran and figures that followed them, like Frederick Church, offered views of America that was untouched by the Industrial Revolution or urban blight, very much like the Fireside Poets. Their pictures are of a simpler time, an escapist, idealist time, where the common works of nature are a avenue for seeing the divine influence of God, the expression of God through nature and ordinary things, ordinary American things, ordinary natural things, ordinary domestic things, ordinary life that all Americans can partake in. The core idea around this is an embrace of what is essentially the European and to a degree English and Scottish concept of the sublime, where it is the sense of an overwhelming divine force, sometimes horrifying, sometimes enrapturing, sometimes simply overwhelming in its power, both for good and for bad. And that sense within the ordinary that all those elements are always present, if only we can see them as human beings. And the special role of the poet is to guide people to see that, to share that vision with readers, with viewers, with anybody, regardless of their education, their sophistication, their cultivation, their culture generally, regardless of all that, their ability to sense that touch of God within the everyday. The influence of the Fireside Poets example is profound throughout American letters. Whitman's posture of the good gray poet, the long white beard and all, is an obvious echo of that in a cosmetic sense. Mark Twain had an infamous run-in with them during Whittier's 70th birthday party. You can see Robert Frost kind of aping them in the style and content to a degree, both of his poetry and his persona. And even the likes of figures like T.S. Eliot, Ezra Pound, Stevens, and Williams, those high modernists with their intricacy and their complications and their very conscious, deliberate complications and sophistications, is a kind of reaction against the good gray poets, against the firesides, and trying to eschew that provincial, parochial nature of them for something more rarefied. So even in rejecting those figures, they are still being controlled by them. The anxiety of influence, of course. And that is fun to watch, to seek out, because their brand, the Fireside Poets brand, was so huge and influential. And in the public at large, the poetry continues to be popular, continues to pop up in anthologies all the time. It is not necessarily the favorite in an academic world. It is not necessarily the favorite in a avant-garde, sophisticated world. But in common collections of, the most popular poets ever published in America and stuff like that, you find a great deal of their work. And a lot of it is really great stuff. The unifying theme that you can find in there, despite whatever diversity that they have among them, and admittedly it's not all that much, but whatever diversity you find among them, there is always this thread, a simple, consistent thread about the simplicity of character and this striving to see magic in the ordinary. These are cornerstone ideas for the American archetype, and they coined that in their way. They coined that 2 centuries ago, and we are developing it ever since.